You're listening to New York's only home for Reefer Madness. Every week, we'll explore the unique perspective of cannabis in the global hub of commerce and culture. Hear the insights, stories, challenges, and successes of those blazing a path from Brooklyn to Buffalo and everywhere in between. I'm your host, Kalen Castetter, coming to you from the Green Valley of Opportunity, Binghamton, New York. This is the Empire State of Cannabis. Welcome to the show. Today we have a highly respected and successful entrepreneur from upstate New York, Eddie Brennan. He's the president and co-owner of Beak Skiff 1911. Eddie, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on the show.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, I think a lot of the guests, they know you guys maybe in many different capacities, right? Maybe they've purchased 1911 cider from their local bar, or maybe they purchased some of your spirits, right? Maybe they've been to the facility in Lafayette. So why don't you let us know exactly what Beak Skiff is, 1911, what's the relationship there, in a way that people might recognize you?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a multifaceted family business. So, I like to think we're still a small business, but, we cover we go across a lot of different product classifications, and customers interact with us in a lot of different ways. So, we're a vertically integrated company starting out in the orchard. So, we go all the way from tree to bottle. So, we have 1,000 acres of apple trees planted here in Lafayette, in the Lafayette Valley, and we have,
Wow.
25 different varieties of apple trees. So, we're first and foremost an apple orchard, and that's where everything starts for us. Out in the orchard, and we have an amazing orchard team that's been with us for a long time. My cousin Pete runs our orchard crew. He's part of the 5th generation of our family business. So everything starts there, and we work our way up the vertical chain. So we start with the apples. We move into fresh cider. So we press all of our apples, and then from there, out of our cider mill, we break it up into fresh cider. We'll send cider into one of our other facilities where we'll make hard cider, and then ultimately we make spirits as well. So, we try to move the apples up the value chain, try to get everything we can out of them. So,
yeah, that's interesting. The idea of moving product of the value chain. Let's get back to that with the hemp, but I do want to touch on the fact, you talk about your cousin and you talk about where everything starts. Well, is 1911, is that really where everything starts?
Yeah, I mean, so it's 1911's been probably the most visible part of our company over the last 5 years. So it's the brand for us that's mostly widely distributed. So it travels out to 15 different states, and that's what the younger generation probably knows it for. But really, the Beak Skiff brand is the brand that's been around for over 100 years. And
so
really,
that date, 1911, though, that's true, tried and true, and that's when you guys start out Beak Skiff, that's when the whole business started?
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're a 108-year-old family business, now in our fifth generation of ownership. So that's,
wow.
As you look at businesses and 90% of businesses don't make it to the 3rd generation. And, we're very proud to be in the 5th generation of true family ownership. And, it's really been innovation and change that's allowed us to survive all of these years. Because if we had just stayed an apple orchard, I don't know that we'd still be in business. So it's allowed us to continue to innovate, create new products, and move with the times.
And you're part of that original line, that original family line?
Absolutely, yeah. So we have Beaks and Skiffs. I'm part of the Skiff family. My grandfather had 5 daughters, and so we had a lot of son-in-laws that were in the business. And about 5 years ago, we had a change in ownership. We actually, about 5 years ago, had a devastating crop. Actually, maybe 6 years ago, had a real devastating crop in New York State where we lost about 90% of the apples in our orchard. And that was
wow.
The genesis for kind of looking at our business and saying, we need to diversify out of just making fresh cider or just selling apples to grocery store. How can we protect ourselves from going through something like this again? And that was really when we started to look at spirits and hard cider and find a way to diversify and not be so reliant on just the apples for the grocery store consumer.
Yeah, and I think that's a story that plays out all over rural America, right? You go from apples going to pretty much a commodity, right? I mean, you didn't really sell many apples direct to consumer in that business, did you?
No, we were always a supplier of apples to Wegmans and Tops,
Mm.
but that was never where we got the most value. We always got the most value as we moved the apple up the supply chain, and we still are a purveyor of fresh fruit to different packing lines throughout New York State. But what we've always realized is, the farmer's the first one to get hurt when there's a dip in the price of a commodity or a drought or in the case of apples, frost or hail. The farmer's the first one that gets hurt, and the processors are the ones who set the price, and ultimately the retailers do as well. So we've learned how important it is to work our way up that value chain to try to be more at the processor packing side of the business, and really all the way up to trying to make a finished product that we can sell then to customers.
So are you taking lessons learned there and you're translating into hemp too, right? Because you guys just announced another part of your business, which is extraction of hemp. Do you want to expound a little upon that? What made you, well, first off, what made you say, all right, I want to enter this crazy hemp industry, right? And then how are you taking what you learned from the Apple business and your whole business, not just an Apple business, right, into cannabis space?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, at Beak Skiff, we're all about change and diversification. As we looked at our land, we do have 1,000 acres of apple trees, but we still have some additional land. And we looked at how do we diversify, and we saw what was going on in the hemp space, and we saw that there was a way to take the plant and vertically integrate it all the way up to a finished product. And that's at Beak Skiff. What we really love to do is start with a product in the field and try to create finished products that can tell a story. I think as I look at the hemp space, unfortunately, what I've seen is a lot of people getting into it maybe for the wrong reasons or trying to make a fast buck. And you see what's happened over the last 12 to 18 months in the space is I think people, there was a bit of a rude awakening in that, farmers tried to grow, 15 to 20 acres, realizing how hard it is to grow the crop. But also that, maybe the market wasn't as robust as they thought they were. So going back to Beak Skiff and where we were, we knew always that when we got into the space, when we were growing hemp, the ultimate goal for us was not just to sell hemp as a commodity product to other processors. We knew we had to really vertically integrate, and if we couldn't process ourselves, we weren't really convinced that we could survive in the space. So we really tried to apply for that dual growing and processing license, so we could not only process our own crop, but potentially help other farmers process their crops. Because what we've seen, we've been able to do that in the apple space as well. We're a major buyer of apples from different packing lines and farms in New York State. We purchase hundreds of thousands of pounds from other orchards, and we've seen how that's helped some of the orchards survive in New York State. So we see a similar way to help other farms as well.
Yeah, and so is your vision on the hemp? You talk about vertical integration. Does that mean going all the way to the consumer with a product?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we ultimately the ultimate vision for Beak Skiff and what we're good at currently is making beverages. So we operate 3 separate beverage facilities. We operate a fresh cider plant where we make some cold brew coffee for some retailers. We operate a hard cider plant where we also do some non-alcoholic beverages, and then we operate a distillery. So 3 separate, distinct beverage facilities, and we ultimately want to vertically integrate all the way to putting CBD, water soluble CBD into beverages, and that's the ultimate goal for Beak Skiff. And I think we had a little bit of a false start last year when we tried to release a product, and we're too early into the game and realized that potentially we were breaking some rules and had to pull back. But ultimately, that's where we want to go, and I think that's where we can have a lot of success, and that's ultimately where I think a lot of the consumer demand will lie in putting CBD into food and beverages. That's where the market will explode when the FDA can make up their minds on where to go with that.
Well, absolutely. So from the alcohol space, and I was in the craft alcohol space also, and in the hemp beverage space with an alcohol product. So can you talk about how important regulations are? I mean, you've seen, so is it not true that what you guys do there at 1911 maybe wasn't possible before they sort of remodernized the Farm Brewery Winery Cidery Act in earlier part of last decade?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I give Governor Cuomo a lot of credit. What he did with the craft brewery, craft distillery, and ultimately craft cidery acts, ultimately saved Beak Skiff as a viable company, right? Because we were able to diversify our business and allow us to survive some downturns with the crop struggling. So it's been a huge boon to farms, across the state who've been, whether you look at a winery or you look at a brewery, or you look at the apple industry. It's been unbelievable when you look at the businesses that have benefited from it. But when you look into the craft, whether you look at craft beer or craft wine or craft cider, regulation is very important, and it can be complicated. But at the end of the day, what it guarantees is consistent quality products that are safe for consumers. And I think you and I have talked about this, and you pushed so much for bringing this into the hemp industry. Is that labeling is important, truth in labeling is important, where you source your ingredients matters, and ultimately, I think that's going to matter in the hemp and the CBD space. Is people will care where it comes from. People will care if it's ethically farmed, if it's ethically produced. If what you say on the label, if you say the label contains 20 milligrams of CBD, that it actually contains 20 milligrams of CBD. And in the alcohol industry, there's very little room for error there. So if you say you have 5% alcohol in a bottle of cider, you can only have 0.5% variance legally. And that's verified. And you have to be able to prove that you can verify that. And I think that is something that will be ultimately good for the category. It'll be complicated for smaller producers, but I think it's paramount to ensuring that there's consistency in the business and ultimately that we survive.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an important point. When you say, it's going to be complicated for small producers, because seldom do you have business asking for more regulation. And in this case, you do. But the question now becomes is, okay, I'm a small producer, and Eddie, I respect what you did and this and that, but I can't afford to do what you did, right? What would you say to someone that said, I can't afford these regulations. I can't afford. So why shouldn't I just be able to make my CBD product from my farm in my, facility that's not compliant, et cetera? What would you say to that?
I think ultimately you have to look at the safety of the product. You have to look at the end consumer, and I think for the category to survive and the category to thrive, there has to be safe product. If you, again, going back to the example of the alcohol space, if you said if you labeled something as 5% alcohol and it ended up being 11, you could cause a lot of damage. And I think the only way the customer is going to believe, the only way the customer is going to rely on New York State and farms is if there's that truth in labeling. But there's no easy solution, right, Kaylin? It's expensive. It was the most expensive, building a GMP certified facility, that's also pharmaceutical grade is extremely expensive. It was the most expensive facility that we had to build at Beak Skiff. And ultimately it's a huge barrier to entry. And it's, is everything in the facility necessary? Probably not. But it's the only way to really guarantee that it's going to be a safe product. And also, you really need people that are qualified, that are producing the products, because it's a complicated process, and you need those SOPs in place, those standard operating procedures to make sure that ultimately what you're making is safe, that it's consistent, and that it's quality. And if we do that, then we can compete with the West Coast. We can compete internationally, and ultimately the farms will be better off, right? Because they'll actually have a market to sell their crop into.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. So you pretty much bring up 2 points here, right? Customer, trust, right? Consumer trust, and competition, competitive edge, right? And so I think when you look at the framework that New York is going towards, it's focused on those two aspects, right? So one, consumer trust that when you go into the store, it's a New York product or it's a product sold in New York in general that is going to be compliant. In what does that mean? That means that when I read, 500 milligrams or 20 milligrams per dose, I'm getting 20 milligrams per dose. I'm getting 500 milligrams total in that bottle. But also that there's no contaminants. I'm not taking something to aid my health, but it's actually doing the opposite, which we've seen, in independent testing of other products and on the marketplace in CBD. But then also saying, okay, if you're going to access New York, and obviously New York is such a significant marketplace, but if you're going to access New York, then you must also play to the same rules that that you have, and invest in the same way that you have, because it's right for the consumer and it's fair. Right. And so that fairness, I think absolutely. that argument of leveling the playing field, I think, is the trade-off. It's the balancing act to increasing regulations. Right. Because it's basically saying we're going that way anyways. We need to go that way. And so, but we're not going to put our producers at a disadvantage,
Absolutely. And it's, at the end of the day, it is going to be a barrier to entry, but it is going to ensure quality and consistency and safety. And Beak Skiff, we really want to be at the leading edge of innovation, but we also want to be at the leading edge of doing it the right way and setting an example all the way up the supply chain. We know we've farmed ethically for many years, but also we know how to hire the right people to ensure the quality and consistency. We've looked at, of all the products that we produce and the fan base that we've built over the years is really because the customer knows when they're purchasing a product from Beak Skiff, they're going to get that same product every time. If they order an original cider, they're going to get the same thing every time. And we've seen categories, whether it be within craft beer or wine. And, if you see deviation from that, that's where you start to lose customer trust. And then they'll go back to the bigger producers, the Bud Lights and the Coors, to use a beer example. They'll go back to them because at the end of the day, they're consistent, they're quality, and they follow the regulations. And ultimately, they'll win because of it. So, I do think that there can be a craft element to the cannabis space, and specifically hemp and CBD. I think there can be that craft niche, whether it's organic or whether we're focused on specific strains. I do think there's going to be that craft element. I think it's yet to be seen if that's going to rear its head, but I think it's really up to us to push the boundaries and to show the customers that we can be different. Because at the end of the day, a small processor like Beak Skiff that you could say doing 500 to 1,000 pounds a day is small or big depending on who you talk to. But someone like Beak Skiff is not going to compete with a company that's going to produce 50,000 to 100,000 pounds a day, right? We have to have our point of difference. We have to carve out what makes, the craft cannabis space different. And I think that it's going to come down to us pushing boundaries and us just trying to, create something that the customer's ultimately going to want. Because what's going to happen in the CBD space is there's going to be commoditization, right? Especially when you look at when you push into isolate, you have a uniform product. What's making it different? I think that's going to be the test of the processors and the farmers and ultimately the people that create the end product is how do we differentiate? How do we create that leading edge of the craft space that's going to make customers interested in our products and are going to make them pull us off the shelf, and ultimately going to make us be able to charge a premium or command a premium for our products. That's how we'll win.
I think it's really interesting you talk about craft space and you talk about craft, cannabis products in general. I think about, from a consumer perspective, being a consumer of 1911, right? You don't just buy it because it's from New York. You buy it because it's good and that it's consistent. But also, do you also purchase because it makes you remember an experience you had up at your tasting room, right? Whether it's a concert or just an experience in the tasting room itself. And I feel like the wineries in New York State have done a really good job at that. So from a business perspective, how important is it that you can serve the customer on site? And how important is it not just for that, higher profit margin on site that you just received from that customer being there, but the lifetime of that customer.
Yeah, absolutely. If you look at consumer intent to purchase in a grocery store, there's been studies done that a customer is 3 times more likely to pull your product off the shelf if they've been to your physical tasting room, had an experience, been on site, learned about the history of the product, and ultimately, develops a connection with the product. Yeah, I think you said you talked about being local, and sometimes in the beer space and the cider space, you get in trouble because sometimes people try to sell on the fact that they're local, which is fine, but local isn't necessarily a reason to buy unless you also have the quality and the consistency there. But back to the tasting room experience, that's paramount, and really that's how in the beer and the cider and the wine industry that producers have survived, because you need that higher margin revenue in addition to that place to really interact with your customer, give them that emotional connection to your brand, so that when they're not on your place, not on your property, they feel like they've had that experience. So whether they have a chance to purchase it online when they go home or they see it in a grocery store, that's incredibly important. And I think there'll be an element of that in the cannabis space. I've always joked with my team. I think there's definitely an opportunity for like a pick your own cannabis type of business, going back to like pick your own apples. I don't know if that makes sense in a regulatory framework, but I definitely think there's something to be said for cannabis tours. I remember the first time that I saw a marijuana plant growing, or a cannabis plant growing out in a field. It's a really cool experience to be able to see that, right? It's something really unique and interesting, and something a lot of people haven't been able to experience. And I think there's a romantic element to being able to go out into a field and see that and learn about the plant, because it really is a cool plant, unlike any other plant out there when you look at the uses of it. But I think that the consumer out there is very interested.
I do, and I think the on-premise consumption is really interesting, and it does fit in regulatory frameworks. We've seen the MRTA and the CRTA, when we're talking about adult use cannabis, to have on-premise consumption, and there's nothing that would prohibit on-premise consumption, obviously, with a hemp extract product. So you have a very interesting perspective, because you are in, you talk about Wegmans, you talk about, being in these spots, distributed. I'm not sure, how far your products are distributed, but you go against the big players, right? And so how important is it, as we develop a craft cannabis industry, in your opinion, that we allow producers in upstate New York to open to the public so that they can compete against the inevitability of big cannabis in the way that you have to compete against big alcohol?
Absolutely. I think, going back to creating that emotional connection with the customer, we have to create that open environment where customers can come in and try to understand what makes our product different. I think going in a little bit of a different direction, and going back to beverages and food, I think that is the unlock to helping farms ultimately in New York State and across the country. I think if you look at the acreage that was planted last year across the United States, and you take the total acreage and divide it across the actual need in the United States, there was way more hemp grown than needed, correct? Mm-hmm. But if you look at if there had been the opportunity to put the CBD into beverages and food, you could have been looking at potentially a shortage when you talk about some of the bigger producers getting into it. There's a huge consumer appetite right now to have CBD in food and beverages across the board, and I think that when that gets figured out, all bets are off. I think the category really thrives. I think right now we're at a time in the industry where we're a bit stalled right now when you're talking specifically about CBD. Yep. And I think that there's a need to prove that the product's safe, and I think there's bigger players at it right now that are, if you look at the pharmaceutical industry, that don't have the best interests of small producers in mind. And ultimately, CBD is a very safe product. And we at Beak Skiff, we want to be able to give the customers the experience of consuming CBD in a beverage, and that's ultimately very important to us. And we can't really provide that on-premise experience to the customer, that Beak Skiff experience, unless we can give it to them in beverage form.
Yeah. So what you're saying is, if there regulators and lawmakers listening on the federal and state level, that they're in action really on CBD and beverage, and on the federal level, the obstruction is preventing you from being able to develop your business and preventing farmers from having an outlet, a significant outlet into the market.
Right, absolutely. And I think, when you look at safety in beverage, because that's ultimately what's important, right? Ensuring safety, and also ensuring efficacy of the final product. And we look at, you and I have talked about, beverages, and should they be produced in a CFR 111 facility? Should they be produced in a CFR 117 facility? And not to get too much into technical terms, but the beverage industry has unbelievable GMPs in place and great certifications to provide safety to the consumer that are adopted by everyone from Wegmans to Tops to Price Chopper to all of these grocery stores. And we really believe that these are the guidelines that can ultimately be used when we're talking about putting CBD into beverages and ensuring that the product's safe, ensuring the product has the effective dose. I don't know that there's a need to rewrite the regulations on when you look at beverages and how they're produced. We feel like we have the right framework, and as long as the GMPs are being followed, it should be a very safe product.
Yeah. Do you think there's any more danger in consuming a CBD beverage than consuming an alcohol beverage from a public health standpoint?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely not.
Yeah.
I actually think it'll allow people to have, the average customer will have the opportunity to experience the product because they'll be able to include it in their daily ritual, whether that's having a cup of coffee, which we produced a cold brew coffee last year that was delicious and unfortunately didn't see the light of day, but or whether they're drinking a seltzer, or I think when you start talking about alcohol, there's some questions there. I don't think we're ready for that, but I think in terms of non-alcoholic beverages, it could be a home run.
Yeah, no, I think the argument against allowing CBD in food and beverage, the argument that the FDA puts forward, I think falls apart in a lot of ways when you start to look at, when you just go to your convenience store and look at what you have available to purchase as someone who's over 21. And that's what I mean there, right? So an alcohol product, Red Bull, I mean, any of these products that could possibly or have been linked to certain adverse health effects are still available to the public, and rightfully so. And so that it is, it falls apart from a public safety standpoint to say, no, cannabinoids, non-psychoactive cannabinoids such as CBD cannot be included in beverages, right? And so from a logic standpoint, it just doesn't make sense to the consumer and shouldn't make sense to regulators either. So, I think it's an important point. So Eddie, so if, for all the listeners that have listened to this and they're like, wow, this sounds like a great brand, great opportunity. Obviously, your CBD beverages aren't on the market yet, right? But where can someone go to find a little more information about you guys and maybe try your non-CBD beverages?
Yeah, absolutely. So beaconskiff.com is our family website where we have a little bit of our family history. That's where we sell our apples and our fresh cider. And then 1911spirits.com is where you can go online and learn more about our alcohol division. You purchase our spirits. Actually, you can't buy vodka and gin and bourbon online. It's illegal, but you can find it in most of the local liquor stores in New York State. And then, the fresh or the hard cider we can sell online.
Excellent. So, I think that this is a great conversation, but more than anything, this shows what the potential of the cannabis industry is, right? You have someone who've been, successfully looked at the marketplace in your business, in Beak Skiff's business, and said, okay, I need to do something more. I need to, develop more down the supply chain, right? And become more vertically integrated. But at the same time, let's create jobs. Let's create, a great opportunity for the community. And now you're looking at the cannabis space in the same way, right? And this is part of a success story that I think we can see more and more of as New York State, really pushes for the development of this industry. And I think that, looking at what you're doing and taking lessons from it, right? Not necessarily saying, okay, I'm going to be Beak Skiff because maybe you're too small. But maybe saying, okay, the lessons of thinking through the customer, thinking through my business plan, thinking through my strategy with the customer in mind the entire way is best if I'm going to enter a turbulent marketplace like the cannabis industry. And if I'm a regulator and I'm a lawmaker, I'm looking at this and saying, okay, how do we ensure that these kind of businesses can succeed and thrive? Because the reality is, if it's not you, it's going to be InBev, it's going to be Constellation Brands doing this, and they're going to be doing it in another state. And that's just the reality. Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. And I hope ultimately that, we make CBD and ultimately, marijuana more accessible to people. I think if you look at I think the pricing right now is at such a premium price point that it's not accessible for everyone.
Yeah.
And I hope that, as the category gains more momentum and becomes more established in New York State, that there is more accessibility of price point and selection for people. I think that's very important.
Excellent. Thanks, Eddie. And, for our listeners today, subscribe, leave a review, all these things as we continue to bring you stories of entrepreneurs such as Eddie, leaders in the space every week on Empire State of Cannabis. Thank you so much, Eddie, and good luck for your business.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.